Hey guys, it's Graham. What's crackin'? This week's installment, as I continue to read through What So Proudly We Hail, introduces us to the writings of one Ralph Ellison. I understand that he's famous for a book called The Invisible Man, but I have not read it, can't opine on it. He was a black American who lived from 1914 to 1994, made it to the ripe age of 80. And he came up during the World War II years and then lived through the Civil Rights era, so he saw a lot of big transformative moments in American history. The short story that he wrote that's contained in this book is called In a Strange Country. It's a piece of fiction, but it's the kind of thing that he very well could have and probably lived through himself, or at least something very similar to it. As he was a merchant marine in the 1940s. The story centers on a man named Mr. Parker, and well, let me just read you a little bit from the introduction here to this segment. In this story, a black sailor experiences both American racism and Welsh hospitality and patriotism when he goes ashore in Wales during World War II. As with Mary Anton, the contrast between life in America and life elsewhere shapes the protagonist's emerging attitude toward and attachment to his native land. I thought that this was really relevant in light of some of my own personal experiences, having spent time in Europe, having lived overseas, especially in a tumultuous time in the world. When I lived in Spain, it was right after the 2003 Iraq invasion had commenced, and at the time, the reigning party in government was the Partido Popular, the People's Party. President Aznar belonged to that party, and he joined the 30-nation coalition that went into Iraq, led by the United States. That was a wildly unpopular decision in Spain. It led to the Partido Popular getting booted out of power the following spring, and it was more or less the wrong place and time to be a young American, especially one that was walking around wearing a shirt and tie all the time. I heard plenty of whispers here and there from young kids and old ladies alike that, oh, look at these guys, they're from the CIA or whatever. I got a small taste of what it feels like to be mistreated because of where you're from. There were businesses that wouldn't serve me because I was an American. There were people that would just walk by and spit on me because I was an American. Not a great feeling. Certainly nothing akin to what Mr. Ellison would have experienced, as a merchant marine, and certainly nothing like what his character Mr. Parker experiences in this story. To give you a brief summary, and keep in mind, this is back in a time when the armed forces in the United States were segregated on the basis of race. He pulls into a harbor in Wales, and as he's walking along the dock, this is kind of later at night, he gets jumped by other Americans that are all white. They see that he's a black man, they beat him up, punch him in the face, his eye is swelling up, and then they abandon him. And he's found by some Welshmen who see what estate that he's in, and they say, let's take you down to the local pub, there's some music, we'll get you an ale, we'll get you cleaned up. And, Welsh culture, from what I understand, my grandmother's grandmother was Welsh. They're big into music, they're big into, frivolity is the wrong word for it, but, merrymaking. And this was at a time when, people were much more engaged in practicing and performing music, not just listening to it. So they take him to this pub, and there's live music, and it's all in Welsh, or following the Welsh tradition. But as the night winds on, and as Mr. Parker's nursing this swollen eye and enjoying this friendly company from these Welshmen, he notices that they start playing national anthems or national songs from different countries. Especially countries belonging to people who are in the room. And at last, as he's just kind of listening, not really focusing a whole lot on what's going on, but at the end of the lineup of music, his Welsh escort kind of elbows him and says, "Hey, listen to this," and he kind of perks up and he hears that they're playing and singing one of America's songs. I don't believe it was the Star-Spangled Banner. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was America the Beautiful. Could be wrong. No, it was the Star-Spangled Banner. Gets to that part where it says, "Gave proof through the night that our flag was still there." They say, "Hey, that's your flag, that's your song, you're American." It was a transformative experience for Mr. Parker to be in the presence of people who were so in love with their own nation, but not in a way that denigrated, their guests. In fact, they celebrated their guests. They of course believed in the beauty of their Welsh culture and their traditions and their songs and everything, but they also made a place for him and celebrated his. They weren't making him feel like he couldn't do that. And what was probably even more meaningful to him, and again, this is one of those things that makes this story seem like it was much more personally about Mr. Ellison than the fictional Mr. Parker. They made him feel more like an American than his erstwhile countrymen did. This is a very powerful idea, and one that was ingrained in me a long time ago by my third grade teacher, Mrs. Poplowski, which, as now I do some mental math, I realize that that was 30 years ago. I was 8 years old. I'll be 38 this week. Mrs. Poplowski was the teacher that got me into writing, but she was also very much a literacy advocate, which is a cause that I take up to this day. It's why I do this channel, not just for literacy, but for historical exploration and personal improvement and personal education as an ongoing cause. She gave me a book when third grade was kind of winding down. And keep in mind, she was doing this on 1990s teachers' wages. She went and kind of raided the Scholastic book catalog and got a paperback for everybody in class. There were kids that were reading different series. There was one kid, I remember Brent, he wanted the next Boxcar Kids book, and she managed to find him the one that he hadn't read yet. She was very tuned into what her students were doing, but she got me this book called Oh Brother. And for the life of me, I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. I was actually looking on my shelf for it, but I think it got mixed in with the books that I have upstairs for my kids because I wanted them to read it. It was about these two brothers that had to share a room, and they were of incredibly different demeanors and dispositions, polar opposites. One was neat and tidy, organized, ambitious, a self-starter. The other one was an absolute mess, constantly stole his brother's bike, and they were pretty much always at each other's throats. This was relevant because, I'm sandwiched right in between my two brothers. My younger brother's a firefighter, my older brother's a doctor and a farmer. And Mrs. Poplowski knew that I contended a lot with my brother, especially over the subject of bicycles. We rode our bikes to school every day, and he always made me lock them up. It was a petty little thing that I got annoyed about, but she knew about it. And she got me this book about these two brothers that fought all the time and had to figure out how to share a room and survive. This is relevant to the story that Mr. Ellison shares here, because the boys in the book were black, and I am not. I'm a little bit Welsh, as we've established, somewhat Irish and German mixed in there, but that was never an issue to the accessibility of the story for me. I related very heavily with the POV brother who was trying to figure out how to survive sharing a space and sharing a life with this other brother that never listened to his concerns and didn't care too much for what he wanted, and they had to figure out how to share a room, how to share a life. It was things like that that made an impression on me from an early age that I wish more people had been impressed by, I guess, especially in this day and age of resegregation and hyperdivision, especially on the basis of race. there's a push for people to see themselves more as white than American, or black than American, or Latino than American. And, you know, to paraphrase our buddy the Mandalorian over on Star Wars, you know, American is not an ethnicity, it's not a race, it's a creed. It's a creed of freedom, of self-reliance, of community, of liberty and justice for all. You know, these things are not exclusive to one skin color or to one point of origin. And I think that's what's important about this story that Mr. Ellison wrote and that was included in this volume. It also harkens back to Mary Anton's story that I shared with you last week. She wasn't born in this country, but she was able to adopt these heroes on, you know, as her own, based on their values, based on their accomplishments and their legacy and their ideology and the good things that they brought into the world that she wanted to espouse. These are the things that we ought to uphold as the successes of the American experiment. Now, you know, me being an amateur historian, as it were, you know, I'm not inclined to gloss over the warts in our history. You know, those are also learning points for us. You know, we can learn what to emulate as well as what to avoid. But we won't learn from those things if we cover them up, and we certainly won't learn from them if we turn around and repeat them. If we keep dividing ourselves on the basis of what we look like, or, you know, where our ancestors came from. We're all here now. Let's be Americans. Let's continue the legacy. So that's my 2 cents on that. I think that's a very powerful idea that Mr. Ellison shared with that story. I think I'm gonna grab a copy of The Invisible Man at some point down the road. Maybe when life calms down a minute. As you can see, I've got a lot going on here in the office, but I'm still gonna do my best to get these weekly stories out here for you. So you guys know the drill. In the meantime, if you're looking for good fiction recommendations, go to upstreamreviews.com. You'll find recommendations and reviews written by myself, Rob Cruzy, Declan Finn, and others. And in the meantime, drive safe, and I'll see you out there.